Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Starship Gaming. And today we are going to discuss something that I'm actually really excited about, and it's the Sega Genesis Mini. Now, the Sega Genesis was a system that to this day, I still love to play it. There's certain games on it that were games that they ported over to the Super Nintendo that were released on Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis versions were always more arcade-like. Of course, the Sega Genesis being a 16-bit console, it really, at the time that the system was out compared to Super Nintendo, it was a really top-of-the-line system at the time. And of course, it had the add-ons such as Sega CD and Sega 32X, which both didn't do as good as the Sega Genesis itself, but the Sega Genesis alone was still a really nice game console for the time. Of course, I grew up in West Virginia, and I'm going to tell you right now, the Sega Genesis was probably the most popular system in the state I live in at the time of release, because literally you back then you looked everywhere and everyone practically had a Sega Genesis. At least that's how it was in my state of West Virginia. I mean, yeah, people had Sega, Super Nintendos too, but you saw the Sega Genesis more commonly. Not saying that the Super Nintendo and the original Nintendo sold poorly in my home state, but literally everyone I knew growing up, even the adults, had a Sega Genesis. And the only other system I've seen this dominant in my home state is probably the PS1 around the time it came out. But we are getting way off track, so let's jump right into the Sega Genesis Mini discussion. So, of course, if you've heard for, at least the past year, there is going to be a Sega Genesis Mini, and it's not going to be those crappy at-game ones. Of course, the at-game Sega Genesis consoles are, well, the only thing that really made them good compared to, to others that have built-in games is the fact that it had a cartridge slot. So basically, it was just a more or less a Sega Genesis Model 3. I mean, if you've seen the Model 3s, they're small. You do one yank of the cord and they pull right off the shelf. I actually own a Model 3, and I know the struggle of it. The Model 3 was the first Sega Genesis I ever owned when I was younger. But it's basically, the at-game ones are basically just souped-up Model 3 Sega Genesis consoles with games built into them. But the Sega Genesis Mini, what stands it apart from, what will stand it apart when it's released, is that it is full HD, has HDMI, a port for your TV, so you can get it in, but the thing that stands it apart is that it is, everybody is cashing out on the craze of systems with built-in games. I mean, this craze has been going on for several years now, but it's really hit its peak, and it's going to keep going and going, and I predict over the next 5 years it'll still be an extremely popular thing that will be occurring. Of course, the whole built-in games craze started in the late 2000s. I mean, it's actually been, going on. You had the Atari one, and the Atari one has been out since the early 2000s with built-in games. So it started, the real craze started in 2009, and then it started peaking. And then around 2014, when the at-game Sega Genesis consoles were out on the market, they were practically everywhere. I remember the first time I ever saw one of those was inside of a Family Dollar store. They were selling them, I think, $49.99 or $50, however they do their pricing. And I thought about buying one, but I decided, no, I'm not going to get one. So this is what I've been waiting for. Something like this for a long time. And I think this is going to be a good opportunity. Of course, it's got a pretty good game selection. I'm not going to name off every single one. If you want to look that up, you can go online and look it up. But it's got a really great game selection on it. The Sega Genesis Mini does. So I am really excited for this. I think it's a great thing. And of course, we've come to that part of the discussion. Whether it will succeed or fail. Well, let's look at it this way. It's got built-in games. It plugs into your TV. It's Sega Genesis, an instant classic. But will it succeed or fail? And that's the real thing that we've came to discuss today. First of all, let's make the first point, the price. The price is not bad. $79 at launch. It launches September 19th, 2019, which isn't, too far from the posting of this video. It will come pre-installed with 42 classic Sega Genesis games, which that's not too bad. That's actually better than what Nintendo was promising on, what they had when they were releasing the NES Classic and the SNES Classic, which 42 games compared to what they had. The NES Classic had like roughly, I think it was 30, and the SNES Classic had 20 plus 1, the one being the unreleased Star Fox 2 that you could only get once you unlocked the first level, once you beat the first level of Star Fox. So 42 games at $79 at launch. Not bad. And it includes Sonic the Hedgehog, which that's a must anyway. So far things are looking good. Now let's look at its release date, September 19th, 2019. That's pretty good, and I'll tell you why. It's right on the cusp of the holiday season, which people start buying for the Christmas holiday season around roughly early September, mid-September. So that was a good time. Of course, they could have launched it in November and still would have had a pretty good holiday season. But of course, this early in the shopping season, they're going to do a lot more sales than say any other thing would have been. And let's compare it to launches of other systems with built-in games. Let's compare it to other ones. Let's say, we don't have it yet. I mean, there's, of course, previews and people who've tried it out already and whatnot. But let's look at it this way. Let's compare it to, say, the NES Classic. It's got more games. There's really not much difference other than it's got different games. Sega Genesis, NES, and the SNES. The thing that's really sets out is the games. Of course, the modding community will love to get a hold of this thing. I'm sure that they'll figure out how to get the whole North American and Japanese Sega Genesis library on this thing, probably within a matter of days, if not within the first 24 hours after launch. And then, of course, we have to look at the infamous PlayStation Classic. Oh, man. Don't get me started on that. If you haven't seen the episode we did on it, watch that episode. I was infuriated about that. Like, a total perversion of what the PS1 stood for. So, is it going to succeed or fail? And my answer to that is it will absolutely succeed. It will succeed so well, it'll be ridiculous. I can already tell you that for sure. It's already got a powerful name behind it, the Sega Genesis, Of course, it's built-in games. People are going to buy it. And it's going to make the perfect holiday gift. It will make the absolute perfect holiday gift. Whether you're buying it for your children, you're buying it for your cousin, your best friend, it's going to be awesome. There's no doubt about it. The only thing that's still up in the air is how well it's made, which, I'm pretty sure it's going to be pretty well made. I'm more than sure, but I'm sure that they'll have maybe more models of it. They'll probably release another model that will have more games built into it. I'm sure they'll do that, probably on a yearly basis. I wouldn't be surprised if they made another one. Oh, there's my pen. As I'm writing, I'm taking notes. I'm sure they'll have a version of it eventually that will be based on the Model 2 Sega Genesis. That's eventually coming. That's inevitable, but they just can do so much with this. They can get so much accomplished with the Sega Genesis Mini. It's ridiculous, but it's actually going to be, in my opinion, a wild success. Especially with the new generation that have never played Sega Genesis games before, never even seen a Sega Genesis, and they're like, whoa, what's that? They are going to love it. Children will love it. Adults who grew up with it will love it. Everybody's going to love it. It's going to be awesome. And I'm not paid to say this. I actually don't even do monetization for my channel. So I do this out of pure fun, just to get the word out there. But I sure do appreciate your support, and that's why I do this. I do this to tell you, things I think are awesome, companies I think are awesome, and that's really that for sure. Of course, that's just my personal thoughts on it. You may have other thoughts. You may think it will fail, but I personally, my personal opinion, being an expert in video games, seeing how things have changed over the years, I think it will be successful. And another reason why I think that is because of the at-game Sega Genesis. It was extremely successful despite the quality. That is a proven fact. It was extremely popular. In the early days of my store, the first products we carried were the at-game Sega Genesis consoles. And they were crappy quality, but people wanted them. And that's the reason we carried them, was because of the demand. Along with the one that had built-in Atari games, and then of course we had the one that had built-in television games and built-in ColecoVision games when At Games was on their little built-in games, classic 80s spree kind of deal, And eventually we will talk about the At Games consoles they made. We'll have a video for each one at some point in the future, for the Atari and the Intellivision one and the ColecoVision one and, whatever. But the Sega Genesis Mini will launch $79.99 on September 19th, 2019. If you're watching this in the future, you got a good little piece of a time capsule here. Your time capsule of a video. So, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you want notifications of when we do more awesome videos. Of course, if you haven't seen our past videos, you got a lot of catching up to do. So, you better get started. So, until next time, I will see ya.